Hey everyone, welcome to Generative Now. This is a show where we talk to the builders who are creating the world's most exciting AI products and companies. I'm your host, Michael Mignano, and I am a partner at Lightspeed. And today on this episode, I'm talking to the co-founder and CEO of Hidden Door, Hilary Mason. Hidden Door is a game technology studio using machine learning to build the future of immersive entertainment. A way to think about it is if you've ever wanted to drop into the world of your favorite book or your favorite fictional character, Hidden Door is making that possible. Hilary's been working with AI and machine learning and data science long before it was cool. So in addition to learning a bunch about Hidden Door in this episode, you're going to learn a lot about the foundational aspects that go into all of the products that we're all seeing today in the world of generative AI. So I really think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Take a listen. Very excited for this conversation and want to get into everything you've been working on throughout your career and obviously, especially Hidden Door. But before we do that, I think it's important to go back and understand a little bit more about you and your background. So Tell us about Hilary.
Yeah, the short version is I'm a giant nerd. I've always been a giant nerd in a few ways. Like I love sci-fi. I was a huge Star Trek Next Generation fan. As a kid, I always watched it with my dad. And I went to a hippie liberal arts college where I got to work on creative writing and speculative fiction writing and also majored in computer science. I probably played way too many tabletop role-playing games in college and grad school and something, the kind of play I've always really enjoyed. I went on to study machine learning in graduate school. And at that time, because I am, in my 40s now, like it was a long time ago, 20 something years. And it was not, I think I have to say out loud, like it was not cool. And I think that's worth mentioning also because the tables have turned a bit there. And then I became an academic. And if we're being really honest about it, I was kind of a mediocre one. But I realized a few years in that what I really like is building products that people use and software that people use. Sort of accidentally started a company out of one of my research projects, which is a whole story in itself. It was basically doing analytics in 3D virtual worlds at the time when some marketing folks had discovered like World of Warcraft and Second Life as a marketing space. Early mid 2000s. And then I ended up selling that company literally for beer money, moving back to New York, joining a company called Bitly, which was short links on social media, right when it spun out of BetaWorks, the parent company, became the chief scientist there. And there my job was really, we are collecting this incredible data asset. Can you help us invent the future of the product and the business opportunity space off of this data asset? And that's really where I found like my happy place in the tech ecosystem, which is really existing in that space where there's some technical capability or there's some new ability to do a new thing and then imagining what products we can build for people. And then, going through the whole process of actually making a real thing with a real business around it.
You mentioned some really specific, interesting things that I'd love to dive into deeper, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You said you grew up, going all the way back, you said you grew up interested in sci-fi. Mm-hmm. This has actually turned out to be a theme among almost everyone I have interviewed for this podcast. And another theme, were video games a big part of growing up for you? And if so, which and why and all that?
I've played games my entire life, like everything from the same console games I think a lot of people my age grew up playing, like, Super Mario World and all the, Legend of Zelda, Link to the Past was one of my favorites.
Me too.
And, like the kind of game where you'd occasionally have to draw maps on paper to like figure out how to get through it. The dynamics of a lot of those games were less forgiving at that time. And that, like, I fell into that hole pretty hard. I love those sort of like story, space exploration.
My kids have actually gotten into some of these games that we're talking about right now. We set up the old Nintendo and the Super Nintendo. My kids are like going deep on Super Mario World. I really want them to get into Zelda though. That's like my next goal. Where did you grow up? Where was all this happening?
I am a New York City native.
I want to dig into that actually, because you've been able to see this sort of New York City tech evolution, right? You were around in the days of Bitly. Now, then there was the sort of the mobile revolution. Now there's this AI revolution. What's it like building a company in New York City? I mean, it's very different than Silicon Valley, obviously.
The thing about New York is that it is not just one city. It is many cities that coexist in a very efficient, small geographic space. And so building a tech company, or even, figuring out how to navigate all the things you have to navigate, or in your personal life, is really about moving in and out of these different cities that collide in different ways. And tech used to be a very small one. Like, it used to be, I would say back in 2008, you kind of knew someone who knew everyone. Like, there was the New York Tech Meetup was like the big event of the month, and it was 1,000 people at the NYU Skirball Center. And that was kind of it. It was
awesome. Those were great.
Yeah. And there's something to being in that kind of very dense network where you get to know people over time, and you get to there's a lot of support that comes out of that. And there are certain dynamics in the way you navigate. Like, New York is nonlinear. And that's because of the transit systems and the way people are able to flow from space to space. And so there's certain dynamics here that are very practical and logistical, and then others that are just the ways people collide off each other, that are very different than what it is like to be in Silicon Valley or in a more suburban space.
It's so true. And I do think it's an advantage to building a company here, because you get to access a diversity of experiences and industries, per your point. So growing up in New York City, interested in sci-fi, interested in video games, how do you make the leap to studying computer science in college?
I mean, my story there is actually very boring. I started programming when I was 4 because my school happened to have some Apple IIc machines. And these were basic games. And then in the way that you play games, you think about what if I change the code? What if I get into the code? What if I play with this? And I am also the kind of person who, if there is a button, I will push it. I will probably push it twice and, try to figure out what is going to happen. And so I just naturally fell in love with computing as a way to, I love the way it allows you to think, the puzzles you can solve, the way you can really get to understand what the hardware is doing, what the, layer of software is doing, what you can do on top of that creates something interesting. I just fell in love with it. And so it was always something I wanted to do more of.
And was the creative writing aspect, was that actually part of your studies, or was that more of a hobby while you were in college?
I did study English and creative writing as well, formally. And then in my senior year, I managed to convince my computer science advisor to let me do a independent study on hypertext fiction systems.
What does that mean? What is hypertext fiction systems?
Oh, so this is going again, way back to language we don't really use today. Hypertext was the term for any narrative or text written that was designed around this dynamic connection between elements of text. And in the late 90s, a little bit early 2000s, there was this huge wave of sort of mixed media creativity and experimentation where non-computer scientists started creating nonlinear web novels and, just ways of navigating information. And the problem I was trying to solve with this honestly came from the fact that when I was writing, I found the process of putting my ideas into a single linear narrative to be very painful. And I thought it would be cool to have a linear narrative where you could sort of branch off deeper into one piece and deeper into another piece and link to another piece. And that felt to me more like the way I was thinking about what I wanted to write. And that idea had stuck in my head at the time. And I now realize that was absolutely wrong from a product thinking point of view. But at the time, I was very into exploring it both at the technical level and at the okay, I built a few scripted tools for doing this. What kind of things can I write with them?
Why was it wrong?
The process of writing something clear and linear clarifies thinking. And we could debate this probably endlessly, but I now believe that it is the work of writing to create a linear document. It doesn't matter if it's fiction or a tech document or a white paper or whatever, such that somebody else can come along with all of the language and context in their head, and they can read what you've written and they can update their mental models to understand what you want to communicate. Like, that's actually the skill of it.
This is fascinating to me, and it's actually something I really wanted to talk about with Hidden Door, because I almost feel like what's happening with AI and maybe Hidden Door to some respect is kind of the opposite of this, right? Reading a story, the story is, I think, as they say, like deterministic, like it's already been determined, right? Is that right? AI, these large language models are more probabilistic, right?
That's right.
We don't know what they're going to say. So it's just interesting to hear you say that the way that you were doing this work back in college was wrong, and was sort of in conflict with what's happening now. But let's revisit that in a bit. Talk to us about how you make this leap from computer science and creative writing and storytelling to academia.
Done a internship at AT&T Bell Labs as an undergrad. I'd done an REU, which is a research experience for undergrads. I really enjoyed being in that kind of creative thinking space, like trying to solve a problem nobody has ever solved before. And so I ended up going to PhD program. But it was the easy way out. I don't think I thought it was like, I like being in school. I like research. I'll just go over there and do more of it while I figure out, what I really want to do. Which I would never have admitted to you then, but I think I can now. It was not the right fit for me. And certainly not at that time. I was way too young. I had way too much energy and impatience, I should say. Like, there are plenty of people at that age who are very mature and have patience and can understand how to work in these systems. It was not a great fit for me at the time.
Tech product building, especially software product building, I should say, seems to favor people that don't have patience.
Yes.
Right. A lot of founders just want to build and move and get stuff in the hands of people. Yeah, talk to us about that transition.
It's a bias to action. And it is, there are plenty of environments people can go work in. Like, when you choose a job, you're choosing as much frankly, the social dynamics and the status games of the environment as you are choosing what you're going to work on and who you're going to work with. And again, this is something it took me a long time to understand, is that there are certain things and there are certain dynamics in universities, in enterprise companies, in large tech companies, in small tech companies. None of them are necessarily any better or worse than others, but they are different. And it is worth being thoughtful about the dynamics of the space you're working in when you try and work in that space. And it's something I came to appreciate very keenly later on through my work at Fast Forward, and some of the work we're doing now, frankly, with our content partners. Like, they come from a very different pace and way of working together.
Well, it seems like the transition paid off for you, because you've now been a part of so many interesting projects and companies, and it feels like you've been at the moments that have been sort of foundational and transformative for entire movements and categories within tech. You were at Bitly, you mentioned briefly. That experience, from my perspective, seems foundational. You were watching the way traffic moved around the internet at a very sort of foundational time. Talk to us about that experience. I think that's really, really interesting.
It was incredible. And I want to say that at first, I kind of resisted finding it interesting, in the sense that the founding CTO was someone I'd met, and, he would email me. He'd be like, "Oh, we got like 10,000 links in this little project. What do you think you could do with that?" And I'm like, it's kind of whatever. And, then he'd be like, "Oh, we got 1 million now. I think we're getting 10 million now." And finally, something clicked in my head where it's like, oh, wow, this is actually something really new and interesting. And it's that kind of space where, like, nobody has had the opportunity to think about it yet. I want to think about this. And so I ended up joining the team there, and I got very lucky in that, just pursuing that interest with really talented, interesting people. So I came from this machine learning perspective, but, we had, a math professor, another CS professor. We had, Drew Conway, who's coming out of quantitative political science at NYU, and Jake Porway, who's in research and development at the New York Times at that moment, coming from a statistics background. And we were able, and again, this is the New York's like little cities inside of other cities, like we were able to sort of come together and talk to each other. And there was a whole big group of folks who were around at that time doing similar stuff. And we started to realize that, you know, the math is the same. The data is different. The domains are different. The impact is really different. But actually the math and the technical tools are kind of the same, and we should talk about that. And I ended up co-hosting with some of those folks a conference called Data Gotham, like maybe it was 2010, but it was around that theme of like, let's plant a flag and say like, hey, New York, we're all thinking about this thing that is coming to be called data science. Like, what even is it and how is it done well? And then I ended up co-authoring with Chris Wiggins, who's a professor at Columbia, this sort of what we called a taxonomy of data science, which may be one of the first ones ever written down, where we just wrote down like, what even is the process of doing some of this work? And it was almost giving voice to a tension that had been building up, where lots of people were doing the same thing and thinking the same way, and being able to bring those people together at that moment. And this was before people had jobs where that was the title. It was a lot of fun. And realizing that it was impactful across, you know, new ways of understanding human behavior, new products that could be built, new businesses that could be built, new ways to think about existing things. That was a very exciting moment. And I will also say, like, we did not realize in that moment, I think, how impactful on society a lot of these products and systems would end up being.
What is data science? To go back to the question that you all tried to answer for or probably did answer for everyone.
I mean, fundamentally, it is building models off of data sets such that you can make predictions about things that are like the things in the underlying model.
And what did studying the data, digging into the science of Bitly and how people were moving around the internet at that time, what did that uncover for you about human behavior, especially at the, during these sort of formative years of the internet?
I mean, I have many, many stories. I think some of the things that have really stuck with me are that the design of products is as important to the experience as the underlying content in terms of determining the interactions and whether you want those interactions to be like positive, happy interactions, or you want those interactions to be purely growth oriented, but it changes the dynamics of how information spreads. And so using Bitly data, we were able to model things like, how does information spread? What networks does it start on? Where does it go to? What are the dynamics of it? Like this whole like burst of attention and then a decay. Though our marketing person at the time kept telling me I had to stop saying the word decay in public. This is not a good one to say your links are decaying. But we also built a bunch of things like content discovery, and we built a real-time search engine really going after the idea of attention as the currency of value. So not the kind of search engine where you could say like, tell me a fact about the world, but the kind of search engine where you could say, what articles are people reading right now about food in this neighborhood of New York City?
So you started Fast Forward Labs, I think around the same time, right? Or as you're sort of ending Bitly, right?
Bitly. I spent a year as a bum hanging out as the data scientist in residence at Excel Partners, also learning a lot. And then I started this company, Fast Forward Labs, in 2014.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So my idea with Fast Forward Labs was trying to construct and design a business model that would allow us to support independent applied machine learning research. And this came from a few things I realized through the work at Bitly, through the work with Excel, which is that a lot of work, frankly, there were so many opportunities going unexplored because a lot of companies did not have the talent, the data science or the machine learning talent in-house. They didn't know how to hire or manage the talent or the work. And it wasn't enough of a priority for them to have an R&D capability. And so it was realizing that the people who had the data and had the businesses that were at a scale sufficient to benefit from the data science machine learning capability had almost no access to the talent or even the product talent to be able to build that stuff. The people who could build it, were kind of stuck without access to the data or the interesting problem domains. And there was this really great opportunity to essentially exist as a bridge between multiple communities. And so I started Fast Forward to live at the center of academic research, of startups, and of larger companies that had data and had scaled businesses and wanted to do interesting stuff. And I designed the business model so that half of our time and attention was spent on our own research. We did our own program of research. Like the team at that company, I will affectionately say, we were like a halfway house for wayward academics. Lots of physicists, like folks who came out of like economics and psychology and computer science, but people who generally, had that really strong quantitative background, were really interested in working on things that model the real world, which is why I think physicists make the best data scientists broadly, but also had that curiosity and that interest in working with people to build really great products in a very practical way. And so we did our own research. Our customers paid us for access to that research. We were also on retainer a couple hours a month for them to ask questions, or I always said, it's like, we're your nerd best friends on this topic. Those questions ended up being, I'd put them in 3 categories: technical questions, that's easy. Sort of organizational strategic questions, like what should we do with this? Does it make sense to do this? Straightforward, but not as easy. And then the third one I'll say is like executive therapy around like, what even is this? How should I be thinking about it? That's hard, but it's probably the most meaningful type of question to work on. And then the other side of our business was co-developing products with our customers. So either advising them as a part-time team member as they were building something, sometimes building stuff for them or with them. We had some really funny disasters. We had a lot of things that were like pretty successful and meaningful. And sometimes the things that were most financially successful were the most boring. Like we had one on a supply chain, like literally, is this part from this vendor probabilistically likely to be equivalent to this part from this other vendor, which ended up saving a customer close to $100 million in a year. It's like the surprises of it were pretty incredible.
It sounds like you assembled a team of academics and researchers, and you even said it at the time that seemed like not your typical startup. Mm-hmm. Fast forward to now, it seems like all of the hottest AI companies, it's all researchers and academics. They're the new celebrities. It feels like you were very ahead of your time in assembling the team for Fast Forward Labs.
I think so in one way, but I think a lot of there were a few things I did well, and I did them well because I did them poorly first. So I'm not claiming to be any better at this than anyone else, but I still don't see those things being done well broadly in the sense of, I mean, things like what drives status in your in your team, in your organization. Like when you move people from academia, where the status game is publications and how they're going to show up at a conference and events, and it's sort of, every person for themselves. You're not a team. Do I get this grant or that grant? Am I, promoting myself in the best way? And then you move them into a research lab without those status expectations being reset. You end up with not a lot of great work and a lot of dysfunction, because you're moving from a world in which you're really out there for yourself to one in which hopefully you're part of a team with a set of objectives. And again, some companies run it really well. Some companies are pouring a lot of money into it that is not going to yield a lot of value for them. That's just one example. Like there are a lot of things like that.
Do you feel like the wave of teams built of academics and researchers right now that's happening in AI startups is going to backfire? Like, do you feel like there are a bunch of teams out there where the cultures are just going to implode over time and present sort of a real risk to the category?
That's a good question. The last bit. especially because, yes, I think a lot of this is going to blow up
Hmm.
for multiple reasons. I also think a lot of great stuff is happening right now. Like, we have never been in a moment where there was more opportunity space to actually build practical AI-driven products that are meaningful. And so the question I would ask myself is essentially, could we even get to the meaningful work without all the other stuff that's going to be done badly around it? Like, a certain amount of that has to happen because we need to try things. We need to create that space in our industry. And then also, like, a lot of people are learning very quickly how to do this stuff, and people are really smart. So I do think they're going to figure it out. And one of the biggest motivators of that is actually having a product with customers, right? So like, you see the immediate impact of the work you do when people are touching it every day. And when you're working in a more abstract or like prototypey or research environment, you don't have that. But once you have that as a forcing function, you start to figure out very quickly what we're going to keep and not. I would actually think about it in a couple of layers, one of which is, like, I do believe there's too much AI hype now. And in fact, a lot of the angst around AI is focused on that hype. And there's a lot of energy out there in creating that hype. And so that's one layer of danger in the space.
Right.
And then the second layer of danger is like, okay, let's say that you've got a really good problem to pursue and you're trying to build the team to pursue it. Like, are you going to manage that team well? And that's more of a, like, people will figure that out. I have faith in startup folks.
You said machine learning or AI. One question I actually wanted to ask you going into this is, what is the difference between machine learning and AI? Are they the same thing? Are they different?
So I've been poking at this very question since, I'd say, at least 2014. I have a slide I like to use when I try and explain this to CEOs. And my answer hasn't really changed, which is that I would say, and let's go back to your earlier question, like, data science is the ability to build statistical models on data that allow us to make useful predictions. Machine learning is the ability to design systems that improve with the introduction of more data and to have feedback loops. So we're able to make those predictive models, and then we're able to sort of, deploy them out and see where they drift and fix them up again. It's really the ability there's a fine line there and a nuance, but I'm going to say, like, more or less that's where I'll draw the line for the purposes of today's discussion.
Can I ask sort of a clarifying question?
Absolutely.
So maybe this is too simplistic a way to think about it. If data science is the ability to build statistical models that help us make smarter product decisions, is machine learning sort of an automated way of doing that?
Actually, I think that often the answer, that's another dimension of the answer. And it's not really one is in one bucket or one is in the other. And this is not a simplistic question at all, because ultimately we're trying to put a label around a set of work, and it's all deeply related.
Right.
I do think that there is a difference in the kind of work you do when you're creating a model to inform a person to make a decision, where maybe the deliverable output of it is even like a PowerPoint or a report or a diagram, versus building a model to make automated decisions at scale. That's a different kind of work.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's just another dimension of all of this. A lot of what we call data science could also be called machine learning, and vice versa. Okay. It helps me to say they're more at this point marketing terms. And they also, to me, they get your mindset around what frame you're approaching the problem with. So with data science, it's saying like, okay, we have a question, whether it's a business question or a systems question, and we want to take the data we have and sort of build a model that's going to help us answer that question. And then machine learning, you're sort of saying like, okay, I want to make a class of model perhaps that can mimic some of what I see in the underlying data. I don't know. It's very fuzzy.
Yeah. What about artificial intelligence?
So that one, I would say that term came back when deep learning started to be a useful set of techniques. And I believe, again, it is primarily a marketing term used to differentiate from what has come before. And if we go back into the history of artificial intelligence as a field, like, there's been many rebrandings. Machine learning itself was a rebranding of AI coming out of an AI winter, where the whole field essentially stole statistics and like started using it a lot and then rebranded a bit. But again, same people, same kinds of work. And so, if you asked me in 2014 or 2016, I would have said like AI is a term of use that is largely driven by people who are now able to approach problems with deep learning. And that has given us a step function forward in terms of certain capabilities in certain domains, comes with a ton of trade-offs. But it's not, I would still say that most things that we call AI systems are machine learning systems. Like
Interesting.
You could draw the line in terms of like, is it like, what kind of black box is it? But like, that seems to be getting into pedantism rather than a useful difference.
Meaning like we're going to use this approach, we're going to use one approach versus we're going to use transformer models or something like that. Like, is that kind of what you're getting at? Or?
A little bit, in the sense that like, if somebody comes up to me with a regression model and they're like, look at my data science, I'm like, cool. If they come up to me with a regression model and they're like, look at my machine learning, I'm like, maybe not. And if they're like, look at my AI, I'm like, oh no, not okay.
Right.
Like, that's not it. But also, what is? Like, where do we draw those lines? And right now, like, I'm doing it on vibes. Like, there's probably more clear ways to do it.
So we shouldn't think about it as such, hey, we have a problem to solve. Should we use AI? Should we use ML? Should we use data science? Because it almost feels like that's how people use these terms now.
Yes.
And it sounds like that's the wrong way to think about it.
I don't find that to be a useful conversation. I find it more useful to be saying, like, can we clearly state the problem we're trying to solve? Do we have a quantitative objective function we're trying to optimize for? If not, how would we even know what good looks like? And almost trying to get into like, is it meaningful to solve this problem? How is it meaningful? How meaningful is it? Is it even worth the investment of time and energy to do it? And if so, what are we going to do with that? Because there are obviously, I'm the sort of person who can ask a million questions and get really deep down rabbit holes and then realize none of that work has actually changed my decision. So I should probably not have done it. But I do want to bring up that generative AI, which I believe is the name of this podcast.
Generative now. Yes.
Something else.
That's total marketing, I heard. I heard our generative is like pure marketing.
Oh, you mean broadly?
I have people say generative AI is a pure marketing term. Is that fair?
I don't think so, because generative functions, again, are a thing. And they are a thing that says, like, it is the kind of function that can take many examples and then produce things that sample from the space of those examples to resemble but not equal. And that's itself a research point, the underlying examples. I actually quite like that we're using the phrase generative AI because it is wrapping a little bow around that particular set of capabilities. And now I do think it gets overused to mean chatbots, which are terrible in many ways. So it definitely is an overloaded marketing term also, but I think there's a fundamental grain of truth in it that it is worth mentioning the huge step forward function and capabilities around a lot of this stuff and sort of calling it out as an area of capabilities, whatever techniques you might use to actually produce that.
I think we could definitely do a podcast episode that debates this because I've had people tell me the exact opposite, and both of you sound right.
Yeah,
so we should do that at some point.
Let's fight. It'll be fun.
Cool. So talk to us about, I mean, you sold your business to Cloudera, which must have been fascinating and an amazing experience.
I learned a lot.
I'm sure acquisitions are always like huge learning experiences, whether they're good or bad. You learn a ton throughout them. Talk to us about that experience, and then maybe let's hear the transition to Hidden Door, because I have so many questions about Hidden Door, and I want to make sure we have time to get to them.
Awesome. The one thing I'll say is that anytime I was a solo founder and bootstrapped, and like anytime you decide to sell a business, it is a very emotional decision. I think most people know that, but you also can't, this is the same thing for raising money. Like you can't just like, the business is not more valuable tomorrow than it is today. Like businesses hit certain inflection points where they have, like a certain amount of potential energy in them. And you can decide at that point, like, what do you want to do with this energy? And Fast Forward was a business that was growing nicely, like slowly and linearly, had a really, again, great team, really great culture. And it was in a moment, again, it seems like it was like the little baby AI hype before the big one, but it was in a moment of a lot of people starting to build out AI product research. That happened to be something my team and I were very good at. And I had a couple of inbound offers that were incredibly interesting, like joining, one unicorn as their sort of AI product research team, or joining another company, like to sort of accelerate some larger scaled businesses in an area that was very interesting to us. And I ended up joining Cloudera because it seemed like the best fit for my vision, for where I wanted to go, the scale I wanted to get to, the kinds of work we wanted to be doing. And in many ways, that did indeed work out. It was really interesting to join a large, then public company, to also, honestly, for the first time, be an executive in that kind of context. As you can tell, that's not my natural habitat, but one that it was fun to play in for a few years. And also to think about, like, how do we now take the scale of this business and have the kind of impact we want to have? And we built a lot of great stuff. So when I say Fast Forward did our own research, like, we had very wide research interests, and anyone who's interested can still go to blog.fastforwardlabs.com and you can see a lot of the stuff there. But, and you'll see a lot of, like, our very first research report was in natural language generation in 2014. We built an app that wrote real estate advertisements for New York City apartments. And we wrote a technical report with a bunch of code as to, like, how you too can have this fun capability. And again, did a bunch of work in summarization, both extractive and abstractive, using embeddings, and then using what would now be called generative AI, to our earlier question. But we also worked in things like causality and in sort of multitask learning systems, which was one of those research things that absolutely it broke my brain for a week. The idea that training one deep learning model on multiple unrelated tasks could actually give you better results than training a single model. I love those moments where just your fundamental understanding of the tech, like, just gets shaken and re-scrambled around. We had a bunch of those at Fast Forward. And then what we would do is actually take a lot of that stuff and help people build products. One of my favorites was with State Street Bank. We helped them build this app that sat on a news feed of 15,000 news articles a day and then clustered and summarized them for their commodities traders. And again, the philosophy of this was very much like machine learning in this sense, and embeddings everywhere, is really great at organizing a volume of information that is outside the scale of the human mind. And I bring this up as an example because it is the kind of technical and product thinking we're doing a lot of, because it is not about coming in and being like, we're going to replace people with our algorithms. It is really about thinking about what is the capability of this thing? What is it great at? How do I use it in a way that helps this person do their job more effectively? Or even have insight into any of that stuff. We worked with another bank on, like, all the emails their successful salespeople sent, all the emails their unsuccessful salespeople sent, and, like, how do you build essentially an email coach to get people up to mediocre who are sort of struggling using that data. And again, this was all similar tech, but, like, all before this generative AI rebranding.
So it's about making people smarter, more efficient, more effective. It's not about replacing people.
Yes.
Talk to us about how you ended up leaving Cloudera and when you decided to start Hidden Door, and maybe what inspired Hidden Door.
Yeah. I had a great time at Cloudera, but also it became very hard to lead a $70 million a year business inside a $1 billion business where, the job was not to build new things with new people. It was to, manage internal politics. So it was time to move on. I'd had, again, great time. I met my co-founder there. Let's come around to Hidden Door. So I'd already had this absolute fascination with the technology of summarization, embeddings, even generation.
Can you clarify embeddings for the
yes.
listeners?
So, okay.
All
right.
Cool.
So if we're talking about something like embeddings, the thing that changed was that before embeddings, we could not do this. After embeddings, we could do it, was that it made language computable and comparable. And it did that by essentially mathematically representing the relationships between words or sentences and collections of words. It was just this ability to take language, make a vector out of it that is a compression of that language based on the relationships between things in that language, and then compare it to another vector and say, essentially conceptually, like, do these two bits of text have the same meaning-ish? Are they similar?
And so embeddings are a way to sort of generalize anything that does that. Is that a way to think about it?
Yeah, it is a way to take a whole bunch, and like in this case, a whole bunch of language. So like a lot of it. And then from that say like, okay, these tokens, which are generally words, is an easy way to think about it, are clustered in a space together. And then for any new document, which can be a sentence or even just one word, or a whole document or 10,000 pages, like here's the representation of it projected into that space. And I can compare that representation to others. And if you want to
do what? What does that teach? What does that teach you? Or what can you learn from that?
It gives you a sense of the probabilistic overlap between those things, and also can often be computable. So the classic word to back example is like, you can do the computation of like king plus woman and you get the word queen out the other side. And you can do analogies mathematically in the sense of like, you know, United States, Washington, D.C., and then like Canada, and you'd expect, you know, Ottawa to come out the other end, like analogies in the sense of like the SATs. And I want to give you a hot take though, because I think that embeddings as a class of capability are going to end up being more impactful for the products that can be built than like text generation is. Okay,
so you'd been studying this for a while.
Building stuff with it.
And this leads to Hidden Door.
Yes, though not directly. I think anyone who leaves a high pressure job should take some time off. So I did that.
Definitely.
Very kind to myself. I had a lot of fun with that. And then started thinking in this area of tech, like, again, I like this area. I still felt like, and I think this is actually even more true today, which is strange to say, but I felt like we had not yet explored the products that had become possible because of these generative AI capabilities. And there was a wide open space. And so my co-founder, Matt Brandwine, and I started exploring that space from a product and business lens. And we were looking for something that, you know, was essentially something people would want, but that hadn't been economically feasible or really possible without the tech. Something where the business model was generally additive. Like going back to my social media experience, like I have some bad reactions to ad-driven business models. I don't really like selling people's data when they're not opting into that. I think it is quite possible to build businesses that are where everyone understands the economics and are content with it, where people are actually paying for a thing they want and people are getting paid for work they do. We're looking for that. And then also thinking, frankly, deeply about the side effects of whatever products we're building, in the sense of, I'll give you one example. We explored this idea of like a problem I have every day is like, I'm communicating with people on email, on Slack, on WhatsApp, on Signal, on texts, on wherever. I'm reading a bunch of stuff on the web. And if we have a message, I have to be like, oh, was that an email or was it a text or where was it? I have to go find it. I have to search 5 things. Why could I not just pull that data into one place? And then, you know, as I'm working on something, it can be summarized for me. Like, again, this is going back to like the Star Trek sort of like 2 button presses on that computer can do anything in the universe. Like, how do we get to that? But we realized that, frankly, the business dynamics, the costs of running something like that are very high. The business dynamics are not great. Like, you're selling to professionals, this fairly like saturated market. So, okay, you're going to do an enterprise sale. Oh shit, you've now built a surveillance product, like where companies now have full access to everyone's text messages. I don't want to do that.
Right.
So it was a process of going through the space and then realizing that actually a lot of the challenges of the tech, and like we can get into this because generative models hallucinate. It is by design. It is what they are and what they do fundamentally and mathematically. That actually
What do you mean by hallucinate?
I mean, they spout stuff that is not true. So you can ask, and we all have egos, right? Like instead, the new Googling yourself is to go to, Chat GPT and say, who is Hilary Mason?
Who is this
or who
person?
are you?
Right.
And first even see if you were lucky enough to be tokenized in the model. And then if you are, what is it going to say about you? And it's almost certainly going to get it wrong. Something wrong, like maybe directionally correct. I actually had this happen where somebody wrote this beautiful LinkedIn essay and they quoted me in it. And it was a quote I'd never said. And I reached out to them and I was like, oh, this is great. But
oh my goodness,
where did this come from? And she was like, oh, ChatGPT did it. I'm like, well, it was something really lovely about like data should be democratized and empower everyone. I'm like, I totally say things like that, but I am sure I never said those exact words. It was just really funny. And so hallucinations are because the model is compressing the underlying data and making things that look like it, but not exactly it. And it has no sense of fact or no sense of reality. And that is it is what it is. It is not something you can fundamentally change without changing the architectures pretty dramatically. So we're in this space of thinking about like where does this actually become an asset? Where is this actually fun and playful? And it's in fiction. It's in telling stories. It's in expanding. It's when you don't want or care about factual accuracy. But it opens up a whole host of other problems. So at the time we were working on this initially, GPT-2 was out. It was frankly like super sexist and racist. Like we were asking it to generate kids stories to show our kids, and it was coming up with things like women hate technology. I'm like, I'm personally offended by some of this, and like, and so all of this was input into thinking about what would an architecture be that allowed us to create safe and controllable stories. And by the way, and this goes back to your earlier point, when we read something linear, it has a beginning and a middle and an end that has been designed. And there are structures in that are valuable in communication. How can we create that value while still allowing for the incredible openness of a probabilistic story experience? And how do we, by the way, give the power of that to the reader of the story? And that's where we had the insight that, oh, this isn't about stories. It's actually a game. Like it's a video game. Because games are about interacting with the world, exploring your creativity, and the affordance is there to be able to say, okay, we're not generating what you see until you interact with it. This sort of like, we call it our just-in-time generation. Gives us that ability to both apply structure, but also explore the space and the context, and allows us to use models for what they're great at and not use certain models for the things they aren't great at.
Super interesting. So tell us exactly what the product is right now.
So what we're doing at Hidden Door is working directly with authors and creators and other IP holders to take the worlds that they have already created through their books or movies or TV shows and make them playable social role-playing games with the dynamics of something like a Dungeons and Dragons game with an AI narrator. So from the player experience, you are a fan of something, you read the book, you can't stop thinking about it, you saw the show, you have your own ideas for what stories you might want. You can then go, someday we want you to be able to like read the book, listen to the book, play it on Hidden Door. And it is a social game because a lot of the fun of this is not just like, hey, I made the computer make a funny thing, but rather we together, each with our own characters, collided in this world we already both know and love in this fun way. And so what we're building is a platform for having these fan experiences inside the worlds people already know and love.
I know you were focused on kids. You mentioned that earlier. Is the fact that these models are not deterministic, did that factor into your decision at all to move away from building for kids?
No. Okay. In fact, we started because that was personally, of interest, have kids, want to make stuff for kids, and like realized that in order to build a safe architecture where like I would be comfortable putting a generative thing in front of a kid, we had to build controllability. Controllability gives us the ability, and I think that is a fairly unique thing in the market even now, because it was a large technical investment. But it gives us the ability to sign contracts with people who have contractual requirements about how their characters need to behave, because we have that level of programmatic controllability in our system. And honestly, we moved away from just kids as our audience, because we were doing all of this Zoom play testing with kids in the pandemic, and the kids would play and they were into it and it was fine. And like, we got good feedback. We got weird feedback. Like, it was fun. We had one girl who was like, this is my favorite thing ever. And we were like, great. What does it remind you of? And she's like, English homework. English is my favorite class. And we're like, oh, this is not a good game. We're going to go back and work on that some more. But like, actually it was because the parents would then like, they would always be hovering in the background, because like when someone's lending you their kid and they don't really know you that well, like of course they're gonna supervise, and the kids would be done. We'd be like, cool, anything else? The parent would be like, can I play? I want to see. And then, and so that was more of a product business insight for us rather than a like data or technology constrained one. And we still built in like all the safety and compliance to have kids as young as 9 in the game. And eventually like we will, but our emphasis on launch is actually 18 to 34, because that's where we're seeing that, frankly, that fan energy, like the people who would like maybe comment on Reddit about a movie they saw, or like read a fanfic, or, talk about it. It's that.
But it sounds like this controllability, the word you used, I applied it in the sense of controlling the experience for kids, but it sounds like that's actually important to the demographic you are building for as well. You said, IP holders, authors, creators. That sounds really hard, like a hard problem to solve, given hallucination of models, the probabilistic nature of them. Talk to us about building in that way. I mean, that seems like a huge task. Is that true?
It's all relative, right? It's a fun, hard problem. And it's the thing we started with. And again, like we were living in a world of GPT-2, GPT-3 came out when we were starting to work, when we were building this. And there were a few things that were very clear, which is that when you have unstructured input in, so text in, you do some stuff, you have some big knobs to tune, like how much repetition do I want? How far out on the distribution should you go in giving me an answer? And then the answer comes out. You cannot put that raw in front of a person. Or at least you cannot do it and expect you cannot have the levers of controllability that we wanted. And those are in many dimensions. And so what we've done instead at a very conceptual level is essentially that we accept unstructured input. Like you still put in words and we generate sentences for you. And then you pick the sentence you want. You can write in a sentence if you want to. Unstructured input comes in, but at every turn of the game, we do a bunch of work to update what we call our game state, which is basically a game engine representation of everything in the world, its relationship to each other, where it's located, its properties. Some of those properties are represented in language, like your character might be energized because you drank the coffee, and you would have a condition energized, which would be a language-based token. But we have pre-built a dictionary of tens of thousands of words and phrases with the metadata around what they mean in terms of materials and properties and conditions and what that means. And so at every turn of the game, everything maps into that game engine database. And then from that, we do the computational work of controllability and say basically like, what is allowed, what isn't allowed, what is happening. We update that game state and we use that data structure to generate the text and the art you see in the game. So it is not this like words in, words out with very crude levers of controllability. It's almost a different thing. And we're doing right now, it's 16 different machine learning tasks in every turn of the game. Many of them are done with completely homegrown models. Some of them are LLMs, but the LLMs are used for what they're great at, which is more or less, we might say our game, we have what we call a story governor. That is our sort of like GM process, which will be like, hey, at this point in the story, this is the rail I'm enforcing. I'm going to introduce this trope to like make things fun and colorful. We have a library of thousands of tropes that are pre-generated, hand-edited, sometimes handwritten, which are largely in text, but also with metadata. And then what we do is use the LLMs to color them. We say like, great, we're in a scene in, this, like, we've adapted The Wizard of Oz for playtesting. We're doing Pride and Prejudice next, like all this stuff. We're in one of these worlds. What does a bar brawl feel like right now for this character in this situation, in this moment? Like, who are you going to say is the antagonist? Who's going to play the ominous music? Who's going to make the found weapon? And so I'd say that, like, yes, it's a hard technical problem, but also we've decomposed it. And then we're trying to use each system and each capability and each bit of AI for like what it's great at. We use embeddings all over the place. We use, a few different LLMs. We've built a bunch of our own stuff. We also use a little bit of procedural generation. We do a lot of pre-calculation, which also means our thing actually runs at scale at a reasonable cost, which is another big issue for like AI startups. So yeah, it's fun.
Who's telling the story? Is it Hidden Door? Is it the AI? It sounds like you've built some guardrails, you've built some controls, but it also strikes me that there are ways to tell good stories.
Yes.
So who's doing the storytelling?
It is a collaboration between the original world author, who has set out what is the starting state of the world? What is the moment you enter it? Who exists in that world? What is their condition? What needs do they already have? What story arcs are in progress? They set out the laws of physics, like what to map it into our sort of trope space. Like, what kinds of stories do I want to be generated? What kinds of characters? What other rules are there? Is there a lot of death? No death? How far down the sexy times rabbit hole are we going? Like, are there specific things like this character can, like in The Wizard of Oz in our adaptation, Dorothy can only be hinted at. You never meet her, but she is in the world at the same time as you, because that's the moment that most people are most familiar with in The Wizard of Oz. So you set out all those rules, and then the system is the thing that puts the guardrails on. And honestly, it is a game. It is not a book. It is not a writing tool. So you have an objective, and then you as the player are saying like, cool, I can use language to meet this objective or avoid it however I want to. And so that objective might be something as simple as like, there is a robot character, missing a limb, blocking the road, and you can choose to like befriend it, to help it, to, smush it, like, whatever you want to do that the system decides meets that objective. And that, by the way, is where a lot of those embeddings come in, is like, does this thing meet this generic form of the thing in language?
Who's using the platform? What's the status of it? Can you share any of the IP holders using it or not yet?
Not yet. We are launching in November.
Wow.
With let's say a few different genres to show the full range of what it's capable of, and the kinds of stories that it's great at in those different genres.
And where will the games exist? Do they exist in Hidden Door? Do they exist in, rights holders' website?
They're on Hidden Door, so you will come to Hidden Door to play.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So the rights holders will say, hey, you want to? I don't know. I don't want to use any examples in case I'm right or wrong. But imagine I'm some big media property and I've created some fan experience using Hidden Door. I will send my customers from my website or my experience to Hidden Door.
Right.
They get to interact.
Said another way, we're doing a lot of cross promotion. A lot of our go-to-market is reaching the fans where they already are. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes they do that. With the authors we're working with, they usually have pretty great social media connections with their fans already. So that's really fun. And we also, if any authors are listening, love when people want to give their fans that extra, way to engage with the world while they're waiting for the next book. But then also they can create like sort of special content for the Hidden Door story world that would maybe foreshadow some plot points or some new characters you might encounter. So we're experimenting with ways to provide that kind of access as well. And
is this something that they'll monetize? So they send people to Hidden Door, and then I don't know what you'll sell or how you'll monetize it, but they'll get to participate in that revenue.
Yes, absolutely. Our monetizations, we're in alpha, like we're going to be in alpha. We're not we're not charging anyone yet, but
Okay.
the monetization strategy is largely around that, is that let's pay the creators of these worlds, or it's a marketplace, right? And the creators certainly get a fair bit of that revenue. The other thing we're looking at is our players sometimes want to have access to more of it, like more characters in a particular world, more friends joining the adventure. So we're exploring, inspired more by Discord's model, some opportunities there eventually. But again, that's not where we're putting all our energy right now. Just trying to build an incredible experience.
Of course, that is the most important thing. Going back to building these games, building storytelling through this way, it feels like programming, software engineering. It's so rooted in logic, right? Mm-hmm. Do this, create this function, get this output. But it sounds like building with AI is not that way, right? You don't know what you're going to get out on the other end. How does a software engineer kind of shift the mindset when it's no longer perfectly logical? It's no longer perfectly deterministic. It's a little bit of a surprise every time.
I think one of the biggest mindset shifts in doing data science or machine learning or AI work versus doing software engineering work is that you are moving from that deterministic world where we probably know the thing we're building is very possible at the beginning to one in which it is probabilistic, and we likely don't know how possible or at what level of quality we can address the original problem. And there are a couple of things you have to learn, one of which is that, and this is also why I always say that like agile is where data science work goes to die. It's because it was a process built to support this deterministic construction of software and not one to support a sort of research driven data machine learning process where honestly, like the dirty secret of great product machine learning work is that you start out with one problem you're trying to solve. You realize you can't quite do that at a level of quality or speed or utility that's useful to you. And you reframe the problem driven by what your product needs are to solve something else. And then you try to solve that. And then you probably do that 3 or 4 different times. And so it requires sort of thinking about the problem space in a different way than a lot of software engineering does, because there are certain things you could take as, you just take them for granted as assumptions about what you're doing. Like you're making an app, but apps are possible to build. You do not know that your model is possible to build with the underlying data unless you've already built that model. The other thing I'll say is that in this particularly weird world of generative AI stuff, a lot of the work of building a great experience is actually in getting a really strong intuition for what is being encoded in the specific model itself and how you might access it and where you might put it and what you need to build around it to make sure that you're getting what you need out of it. And by that, I mean, I'll give you another hot take. I think prompt engineering will not actually be a job forever.
Yeah.
And what prompt engineering is just getting an intuition for the underlying data encoded in the model and figuring out the language to like pull it out the other side.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like a moment in time thing.
Yes.
For these models or at least the way we're interacting with these models.
Yes.
Which could change.
Yes. And hopefully will in a bunch of ways. But then the other thing I'll say is I talk to a lot of founders and like people engineering products on top of generative AI stuff. And like every single one is building a system on top of the model to make sure that what comes out is actually what they want to put in front of their people, their users or their players. And so it's making really smart decisions about all of that, which is a completely different mindset, honestly, than where software engineering starts.
It feels like we haven't yet wrapped our heads around all of the different ways in which it will be different. Product development, that is, right? You think about going from web to mobile. We went from clicking to tapping. Yes. We went into mobile thinking it would be the same. It would be skeuomorphic. And then we just tried to sort of like wrap mobile around that framework.
Yes.
What are going to be the big differences in generative, to use the word generative product building or AI first products?
I mean, you just made a great point that I will call out explicitly, which is that frankly, like we don't know what the design metaphors of these products are. And the design skill is as different as the software engineering skill is in its own way. And we're kind of stuck on like chat as metaphor, but I think it's a terrible interface. And it's also not fun for anything other than, right? It's not efficient. And unless you actually are chatting for the sake of chatting, like that is the activity, it is messy. And so
also just a lot of friction, right? Yes. To get a thought input into the system, you have to, especially on mobile, right? You have to tap a bunch of buttons with your thumbs over and over and over. It's not that efficient.
No.
So what will AI native products look like? We don't know yet. You just made the point. We don't know. But if you had to guess.
So I think the way I like to approach a question like that is basically to tease out the assumptions I'm making, because each of those assumptions is highly debatable, and then they sort of drive to a conclusion. And the assumptions I'm making are that we will actually use the ability to generate what someone sees like at the moment they see it, which allows us to have a lot of contextualization, personalization, whatever you want to call it, that is currently not something we see. That will find efficient interface metaphors, and we will as a community sort of grow up around them, ways that we can understand what's going on or like direct it. I don't think we found those yet. I think there are things we can look to in the way we interact with each other as people as inspiration, but that's the stage we're at. And then it's thinking about like, okay, we have a bunch of constraints at doing this stuff right now. Like, frankly, text output is great. Image output is variable quality and controllability. Like we have a whole different visual or art generation system at Hidden Door where we compose things dynamically, but we generate them offline or hand draw them because we want a level of consistency and quality and style that is not yet there. Maybe a year from now it will be. And then there's sort of the multimodality of the world, which we're starting to see a lot of energy into multimodal interactions, but again, no interfaces around them that are sort of standard. So there's a huge opportunity space there. So given all of those assumptions, I mean, I really think about like, it becomes a set of tooling for navigating information in ways that are interesting and fun and contextual to our world and to ourselves. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is that right now, most of these models require GPUs for inference or other specialized hardware. We are starting to see stuff that runs on CPU, and I want to imagine what it looks like when we can run it in the browser, run it in the mobile app, right? Because that changes the design a lot and what you can do pretty dramatically.
You earlier in the conversation mentioned that AI hype is dangerous, which I actually tend to agree with. Talk to me about why that is. Why is AI hype dangerous?
It's a hard thing to address concisely, but I think it is dangerous in a bunch of ways because a lot of people rightfully react, but what they're reacting to is the hype idea of AI, and we have several people out there pushing sort of AGI doomerism. This is, as far as I can tell, a religious affliction. And we have other people.
Doomerism is a religious affliction?
The absolute focus on an existential threat while largely ignoring real scaled harms that are occurring today shifts our attention to what could happen in a way that is largely setting up business dynamics to be useful and profitable for a few large companies and not helping anyone who is actually today impacted by the tech or anyone who wants to, be a small company creating something new in this space. And it is not coming from like an objective evaluation of harms, because that does exist and that work is being done. And that's largely being swept under the like, but what if it came to life and wanted to kill us? And also,
right.
That is in many ways, like that is dangerous. And we've had that in many other areas of tech too, but it's something in this community I think we do have to speak to. I also think that hype is dangerous because it convinces people that hard problems are easy. And, the conversation 5 years ago used to be a lot around like, well, that's not possible. Or, like, how does that even work? And now it's more like, but that's, you just plug in ChatGPT and it's done, right? Like that's all you're doing. Like, and I think that leads to a lot of sloppiness and a lot of things that are built. And again, one of the issues with machine learning AI things in general is that they scale, they work at scale. And that means they can scale harms. They can scale them very easily. They can scale and magnify underlying biases in data. That is kind of what they do by design. And it is a huge distraction from the real issues we already have with all this stuff.
No, it's interesting. I mean, the big theme between both of those things, I think, is that the hype will overshadow the really important and frankly, like the very, very valuable outputs of what is being built right now, which could potentially transform everything, right? Yes, about how we work and how we live, frankly. So maybe, okay, now let's flip it.
Okay.
What are we optimistic about? Like, what is the great potential of everything that is happening right now? And I mean, what gets you really excited?
Yeah, I'm an optimist and very much a pragmatist, but also deeply optimistic. And it is, it is the ability to interact with computers using interfaces we use to interact with each other. It is the ability to build computational systems that can help us model and understand information that we as our poor human brains cannot possibly consume alone. It is the ability to think about taking a lot of the drudgery out of not the creativity and not the joy and the love and the emotion of it, but the drudgery out of a lot of our tasks, like finding a time for a calendar appointment, or things that are, I need to remember to pick up coffee beans on my walk home. Put that somewhere where I can have it remind me when I get close to the place where I always do that, right? It is using these systems in a way that create more space for us to be human, that I'm really excited about. And you see this in our, the work we're doing in Hidden Doors is we're all fans of stuff. We all love being creative together. The game is really about being a scaffold for us to have these really creative, fun, happy experiences with our friends and with our family. And to explore things we already love. That's the stuff that I'm emotionally excited about. And then very practically, it comes down to giving us the ability to control our space and our devices and having input into the way things are parsed for us. If I'm reading a news article, why do I have to see exactly the same article you see? Maybe you're an expert on the topic, but I know nothing and I need 5 extra pages of background and you need only a paragraph to be here's what's changed. Why don't we have that? Help me get there faster and better and remove the extra work of navigating this world of information we all live in.
That's a great way to start to wind down our conversation. Real quick, Hidden Door, what should we be on the lookout for? It sounds like you're launching soon. Where can we learn more?
Yeah, hiddendoor.co or, I'm H. Mason on all the socials and hiddendoor.co on all the socials as well. And we are launching in November in alpha, bunch of exciting worlds, bunch of exciting stuff happening. And if you love the energy of collaborative storytelling and role-playing and doing that in worlds you already know, come sign up.
That sounds awesome. And are you hiring?
We are hiring a few team members in engineering right now, and expanding that next year.
And where can we learn about those roles?
Also on hiddendoor.co.
And are these roles in New York City? Or are they anywhere in the world?
Oh, we're a fully distributed team.
Awesome.
That we're from Vancouver to Amsterdam and try to stay within that time zone range.
Awesome. Hilary, thank you so much. This was a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you giving us all this time.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Generative Now. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Hilary Mason, co-founder and CEO of Hidden Door. If you like what you heard, please do us a huge favor and rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That stuff really, really helps. I am Michael Mignano. If you want to follow me, you can find me at Mignano on all the different platforms. And if you want to follow Lightspeed, you can follow us at Lightspeed VP on all those same platforms. And like always, we'll be back next week with another awesome conversation of Generative Now. Generative Now is a production of Lightspeed and Pod People. Special thanks to everyone on our production team who make it all possible. See you next time.